Well, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to speak at the 6th Advanced GMP workshop on this important and exciting topic. My name is Rachel Harrington, and I work in FDA's Office of Regulatory Affairs, and specifically in the Office of Medical Products and Tobacco Operations. Over the past 18 plus months, I've worked extensively on implementing remote regulatory assessments, including remote interactive evaluations. And I'm passionate about the use of this new tool to support regulatory decisions and oversight of facilities, particularly in these unprecedented times. Next slide, please. A quick disclaimer. I understand this webinar is an informal discussion and my remarks are consistent with that. And for any official FDA statements of law and policy, please refer to the statute, regulations, and agency guidance. Next slide, please. Today, I'll be touching on a number of topics, including an overview of FDA's remote interactive evaluation guidance, statutory context of drug inspections, and how that relates to remote assessments, how a remote interactive evaluation compares to an in-person inspection, steps a facility can take to prepare for an RIE, and finally, some tips for aiding in a successful RIE. Next slide, please. I'm sure by now you've all read through FDA's guidance for industry on remote interactive evaluations. The guidance was issued in April of this year and provides information to industry on how FDA will request RIEs, what firms can expect when one is performed, and how FDA will share RIE outcomes with them. The guidance applies to facilities where drugs are manufactured, processed, packed, or held, facilities covered under FDA's Bioresearch Monitoring or BIMO program, and also outsourcing facilities registered under Section 503B of the FD&C Act. And finally, the policy is intended to remain in effect for the duration of the COVID-19 public health emergency. Next slide, please. Next, I'd like to discuss the meaning of a remote interactive evaluation. So with so many terms being used to describe different remote activities conducted by FDA, as well as other countries' regulatory agencies, I think it's really important to spend a minute clarifying what is meant when I say remote interactive evaluation or RIE. So an RIE is any interaction with the facility other than an inspection or a record request under Section 704A4 of the FD&C Act. So this could include teleconferences, live streaming video of facility operations, screen sharing of records or other information, disclosing records or other similar activities. And finally, an RIE is always voluntary. And I'll talk a little bit more about the voluntary nature of RIEs and how it differs from an assessment under 704A4 in a few slides. Next slide, please. So here are a few important recommendations that I'd like to highlight from the guidance. First, FDA will contact the facility to request interest in allowing a remote evaluation. FDA applies risk management methods and tools to determine when a facility or when to request a facility's participation. And this decision depends on a number of factors, and sometimes that information is not always available or known to the applicants and facilities. And because of this, we do request that facilities not contact FDA to request an RIE. Second, FDA must host remote interactions using the FDA version of Microsoft Teams, Zoom, or Adobe. And the FDA representative, which is often the investigator, will discuss these options with the facility prior to the RIE to identify which platform would work best. Third, FDA communications with the facility about RIEs typically include a general discussion for the remote evaluation. And this is often discussed during the initial virtual meeting that's set up to cover logistics, responsibilities, and expectations. At the end of the RIE, the FDA representative will hold a virtual closeout meeting, and typically they would issue a written list of observations if any were noted during the evaluation. This also allows times for questions or clarifications if they're needed. And finally, following the RIE, the final report describing the coverage and findings will typically be shared with the facility. Fourth, FDA will not issue a Form 483 inspectional observations at the conclusion of the RIE. I'm going to say this several times throughout this presentation, but RIEs are not virtual inspections and they're not remote inspections, and therefore you will not see the same forms that you would typically see during an FDA inspection. Next slide, please. A few more highlights that I think are important to note. FDA may use remote evaluation outcomes for several different ways. So the first is to decide approvability of a pending application, to determine future cGMP surveillance inspection, timing, depth, and scope, to resolve a for-cause need to inspect, so for example, to assess a defect report, and finally, to evaluate facilities, outsourcing facilities under 503B for cGMP compliance. And finally, the guidance states that FDA does not specify the equipment to use in the live streaming video or screen sharing, only that it's fit for purpose. And the equipment will typically be checked during that initial virtual meeting to identify any issues that may impact the ability of FDA to perform the remote evaluation. So ideally, they can be corrected. Next slide, please. So next, I want to spend a minute to discuss FDA's statutory context for drug inspections and how it relates to remote regulatory assessments, such as a record review under 704A4 and a remote interactive evaluation. So the FD&C Act says we shall inspect, and this applies to drug manufacturing facilities. That includes processing, testing, packaging, and these inspections are conducted on a risk-based schedule after establishment register, and they are conducted in accordance with Section 704 of the FD&C Act. The FD&C Act and the Public Health Service Acts do not explicitly require inspections of facilities named in pending applications. However, FDA can and does perform pre-approval and pre-license inspections when it's deemed necessary. Well, this means that FDA can use alternatives to inspection to evaluate operations and facilities when appropriate, and that includes remote regulatory assessments such as 704A4 and RIEs. Now, Section 704A4, which was added to the FD&C Act in 2012 as part of FDASIA, says that FDA can request records and other information in lieu of or in advance of an inspection. And this applies only to drugs and only at places where a drug is manufactured, processed, packed, or held. Now, this authority does not extend specifically to remote interactions, which is why FDA came out with the guidance that we've been discussing to describe how FDA plans to perform remote interactions and what firms can expect. Next slide, please. So a question many of you may have is, how does a remote interactive evaluation compare to an in-person inspection? And as I've said before, RIEs are not the same as an inspection, and you won't hear the terms remote inspection or virtual inspection. And that was intentionally done to distinguish the activities performed on-site with activities performed remotely. Additionally, FDA does not intend to replace traditional inspections with remote interactive evaluations. So ideally, inspections could be supplemented by these additional tools, such as record requests under 704A4 and or a remote interactive evaluation. And this would provide FDA the greatest depth and breadth of information to inform regulatory decisions and support oversight while allowing for the most prudent use of resources, and especially now in these times, ensuring the safety of both FDA staff and industry. Next slide. Another question you may have is, what are some steps a facility can take to prepare for an RIE? So the first one I would recommend is to check the signal, the internet connection signal throughout the facility, just to verify that the signal strength is adequate to support live streaming video and audio during the actual remote interactive evaluation. And be sure to check not just the conference rooms, but other places that the investigator might want to look. So for example, the manufacturing areas, the laboratory, a packaging area, those sometimes have more difficulty in terms of the live streaming. Next, you want to check your portable equipment that you plan to use during the RIE for live streaming, such as a phone or a tablet, to ensure there's no disruptions during the evaluation. For electronic documents and other information, you should identify any limitations and ensure that encrypted and password protected files can be accessed by the FDA representative. Next, documents submitted during a remote interactive evaluation, as described in the guidance, should be in English. However, if translation is needed during a live stream interaction, the facility may need to provide a translator, so something to keep in mind as you prepare. And finally, if a facility maintains paper records and they agree to participate in a remote interactive evaluation, then you would probably want to consider taking steps to enable FDA's remote viewing and verification of the facility's documents, procedures, and electronic systems. And finally, if the requested documents are maintained in a paper format and you do scan them, then make sure that they are scanned as a searchable PDF. It will aid in the review during the RIE. Next slide. All right, another question you may have, what are some tips for during an RIE? So the same best practices you would use for an inspection on site can also apply to a remote interactive evaluation. For example, if you get a request that you don't understand, make sure that you clarify with the FDA representative. So on both sides, it's very clear what is being asked for. I would also recommend making sure that the investigator or other FDA representative is aware when a request will require submission of a particularly high volume of records. And I obviously can't guarantee it in all situations, but they may be able to refine their request so it's not quite so large, depending on what it is. And just as you would during an inspection, make sure you have the right subject matter experts available to explain your operations and answer questions when needed. And finally, be honest and transparent. Just as you would if the FDA representative was on site, you would want to apply that same honesty and transparency to the remote interactive evaluation. Next slide. Well, thank you so much for allowing me to speak, and I look forward to hearing a few questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rachel. It was a very interesting session, giving the details of what is to be expected in the RIE and what preparation should be done by the industry to face such type of audits. I think it was very interesting, and I came to know so many new things in your presentation. Thank you very much for the guiding.
Thank you.
I think there are few questions. I think people have asked a question related to the whether RIE will be valid or will be done for the facilities which are under OAI, or which are the new facilities which are ready waiting for the FDA inspection. Whether RIE will be conducted for such inspections or not, and what is the FDA's view on that?
Yes, that is a question that we have received, and I know it's of great interest to hear. So the guidance does state that we have the ability to perform an RIE as a follow-up post-compliance actions. However, it's going to be dependent on the specific situation and particularly what the corrective actions that need to be verified are. And I will note, this is also something that's stated in the guidance a few times, but if there's any data integrity concerns, then that probably would not be an appropriate facility to perform an RIE. So it really is going to be situation dependent. But as we continue to use this tool, I think we'll gain more experience in seeing, where it is a valuable tool and be able to, use it as best as we can.
Thank you, Dr. Rachel. Very clarified the doubt. Also, another question is come from the audience is related to the whether FDA has carried out such RIEs in India or elsewhere, and what are your experiences in that? What difficulties are faced, what problems are faced, and what goes well generally?
Yeah, so I'm happy to report that we have conducted several RIEs in India, and they were very successful. I think that is due to good communication between the FDA investigator and the facility to ensure, some of the things that I recommended. So checking the Wi-Fi signal to ensure you have, that the strength is enough to support connectivity throughout the facility. I would say I wouldn't even say it was a problem, but I did hear that there were parts of the facility that the strength wasn't quite strong enough. And that's why I recommended don't just check the conference rooms, because typically those are have a pretty strong Wi-Fi connection, but there's areas of the facility like manufacturing, testing, laboratory. Make sure that you check those as well, because those might cause disruptions if they don't have quite the same Wi-Fi strength.
The last question from the people is related to the whether FDA plans to continue RIE as a normally in addition to the in-person inspection, or once the travel restrictions are out, everything goes on normally, you will discontinue RIE as a inspection system.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know one, that's of a lot of interest. So the guidance was specifically written for the duration of the public health emergency. So if we were to continue use of this tool, it would require the issuance of a new guidance that would be open for public comment. However, obviously that decision is above my pay grade, but I do see it as a really helpful tool. And I think as we gain more experience, there's always going to be situations outside of a pandemic where we may not be able to travel to a site. And so having tools in place to continue our oversight and our ability to make regulatory decisions is a really powerful and useful tool. So again, I won't be the one making this decision, but I do see, and I think a lot of others see the value in using a remote evaluation.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rachel. That's all from me. Thank you very much for clarifying most of the doubts, all the doubts, actually, not most of them, all the doubts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.